Here's the outline that you provided to me for Quiz 2 material. It's worth pointing out that you did come through in the end. This is a pretty good list, and it's quite similar to the ones that previous classes have come up with. It is also worth pointing out that I typically refer to these as Quiz 2 material, but I do want to remind you that you don't want to simply focus on the quiz questions. Make sure that you feel comfortable with all of the material, and to be honest, that includes material that only happens in lecture. So let's get to it. So within factors influencing learning, we'll talk first about perceptual learning. And so perceptual learning occurs when aspects of our perception change as a function of experience. So what does that mean? It means that simply by perceiving something over and over again, your very perception of it changes. So for example, imagine having a piece of music that is really very complex, and maybe you've been listening to it for a month, and then suddenly you listen to it another time and you hear something that you've never heard before. That's perceptual learning. And another good example of it is I unfortunately have had many visits to doctors for suspected injuries. So I've had lots of x-rays. Right? And when I look at an x-ray, I see nothing. But a doctor might look at that x-ray and say, oh, look, right here, that's where the break is. And I still see nothing. Right? But the doctor, over time, has learned to see things in that x-ray that we are not able to see. And again, that would be an example of perceptual learning. I know you also asked about implicit learning and implicit memory, and that's right in the same section here. So implicit learning and implicit memory. I want to show you the two different definitions here. Right, occurs when we acquire information without intent that we cannot easily express. Type of long-term memory that does not require conscious thought to encode is the type of memory one makes without intent. Actually, it turns out there's something wrong with each of these definitions, with both of these definitions. First of all, this one, it's impenetrable. I know what implicit learning is, and I don't understand that definition. It is terrible. Okay? So what I'm going to suggest is that you ignore this definition. Implicit learning and implicit memory are really the same thing, right? So implicit learning is the stuff that happens. Implicit memory is the evidence that that has happened. So let's focus instead on this as the definition that we'll use. And students, remember, if you see it on a test, I'm not going to use implicit memory and implicit learning as two alternatives for a multiple choice question. Again, so we'll basically be using them interchangeably. So we've got, for implicit memory, a type of long-term memory that does not require conscious thought to encode. Keep that part of the definition. But this part of the definition, I want you to leave that out because A, it's technically incorrect, as I'll show you in a minute, and B, we've already got something that's the type of memory that one makes without intent, and that's incidental learning, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So what do we mean by a type of long-term memory that does not require conscious thought to encode? It's a type of memory that you may be trying to remember it, okay? You may be trying to learn it, but you don't have that feeling, that feeling that you're getting it, that you're remembering it along the way, okay? For example, learning to ride a bike, right? I taught all three of my kids to ride a bike, and during that process, they didn't feel like they were getting it, right? It's very, very frustrating. They fall, they fall, they fall, they fall, and then pretty suddenly they get it. Right? So, there will be one time where they can maybe go 50 feet without falling. And then as soon as that happens, they are minutes away from being able to ride their bike. See, at no time during the process do they feel like they're getting it. So there's no conscious thought that they're encoding it. There's no conscious thought that they're getting it. But they are, right? Implicit memory was first demonstrated through research with something like learning a list of words. And if I describe this study to you, I think you can get a sense for what it's like, and also the idea that it certainly can involve an intention to learn. So suppose I bring you into the lab and I ask you to memorize a list of 100 words. And the thing that I'm primarily interested in is how long does it take you to do that? So pretend it takes you 30 minutes. Okay? And I give you a test right away, and you're able to remember all 100 words. Okay. Now, 6 months later, I track you down, and I say, hey, you remember that list of words you memorized for me 6 months ago? And you're like, kinda, maybe. I say, hey, how many of them can you remember? Right, so how many do you have this conscious memory of? And the answer is none. Right? You can't remember a single one. But suppose instead I say, here's the original list. I want you to memorize it again. Take as long as you need to until you get all 100 of them. Remember, the first time it might have taken you 30 minutes. The second time, 6 months later, it might only take you 15 minutes. So you were able to learn it faster the second time. That kind of shows you that there was some memory from the first time. Okay? It wasn't conscious, but it was there because it allowed you to remember it, to learn it faster the second time. That is an implicit memory. So now I want to talk about incidental learning. And I realize that I've jumped ahead a little bit, but I think it's important to do that because there is actually some confusion between implicit learning and then incidental learning. And as I even implied a few minutes ago, the textbook kind of gets it wrong, right? So implicit memory, as I just said, is a sort of outside of consciousness memory that happens. You may be trying to remember it, okay? Incidental learning really is learning that occurs when you're not trying to learn, okay? So the idea that, maybe you travel in the passenger seat to a location for, a month straight, and you never really pay attention to how to get there, okay? And you never really tried to learn how to get there, but after having done it for a month, and then you have to drive there on your own, you realize, hey, wait a minute, I know how to get there, okay? That's incidental learning. You weren't trying to learn it, okay? On the other hand, of course, intentional learning would be when you are trying to. Okay? Since we're here, I think it's important to point out that the textbook is a little bit misleading here, okay? Where you see that it says that you might think that the most important thing is to try to learn. Okay? Interestingly, this is not true, at least not completely. Um, that might make you think that incidental learning is better than intentional learning, right? Because we at least have a suggestion that that can be the case, right? Intention learning without the intention is better than intentional. Such examples are not particularly rare, not limited to recognition. Actually, the truth is they are on the unusual side, and it's really a ridiculous concept to think, oh, incidental learning is in general better than intentional learning. If that were the case, there would be no point going to school, right? You wouldn't need to try to learn at all. The learning would just happen naturally. Generally speaking, trying to learn is more effective than relying on incidental learning. Okay. That said, there are some situations in which trying to learn is not going to be enough, right? So intentional learning will not be sufficient, and you might even learn it better through incidental learning. And that is this key idea here about what it is that we're doing, right? You have to effectively encode the material in order to learn it.